Last week, I began a new series talking about thriving with God and what it means to thrive with God and how we go about doing that. And so last week, I started the series by talking about thriving with hope and talked about how hope is the motivation that really pushes us forward when it comes to thriving with God. Hope gives us that motivation. And so now what I would like to talk about this week is thriving with flexibility. Whereas hope gives us the motivation to move forward and thriving with God, I believe flexibility is what gives our thriving longevity. It's what lets us continue thriving year after year after year. And flexibility, what that means in a spiritual sense, is recognizing when you have to take a different approach. So when you have to mix things up, when you have to stop doing things the way you've always done it before, and being able to recognize how to change it as well as what to change it to, and knowing when that time comes. And it's important for all of us to have flexibility in our ministry. And I think the last few months has proved this more than anything else, more than anything that I could ever say, as we've seen the world change so much, and many of the methods that we've used for so long are no longer able to reach people. They're no longer relevant, and many churches, many different ministries have had to change how they do ministry, and it's been difficult for a lot of people. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so difficult was because our ministries were so structured to really a point that hindered us, so that when this situation came along, that because our ministries were maybe overly structured, that we weren't prepared to do ministry in a different situation. And this is why flexibility is important, is it lets us recognize when we have to make changes, and also prepares us to be able to make changes as they come along, or even before they happen, so that our changes aren't just reactive, but proactive. And I want to look today at the book of Judges, chapter 7, to look at the example of someone who needed flexibility in order to succeed. And it's the story of Gideon. Now, God gave Gideon the task of leading the Israelite army against the Midianites. And Gideon was not the person that anyone else would have picked for the job, because Gideon had no military background, he had no experience. But I think God chose him because, along with that no experience and no history of fighting, what else Gideon had was no routine. And because Gideon had no routine to follow, he couldn't just lean on his old habits to lead the Israelites against the Midianites. Because he didn't have that, I think it allowed God to use Gideon in a more flexible way. So let's read about how this happens. This is Judges chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, 'You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into your hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead.' So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, 'There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them for you there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go.' So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, 'Separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink.' 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am giving it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and listen to what they are saying. Afterward you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into three companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. I love this story because it's such an incredible picture of how God used Gideon in a very peculiar way to do something that would have been seen as impossible otherwise. And there's some things about this passage of Scripture that I want us to recognize. The first is that all of the things that Gideon did at the start of this chapter, he did because he was listening to God's instructions. And every change that he made was from God. He listened to God before making any changes. And this gives us the most important thing for us to remember about flexibility in church and in ministry, is that flexibility must be led by God. That any changes we make, anything we decide to do differently, needs to be by God's direction, not our desires. And so we have to also give room for God to speak into our ministry and give room for God to do what he wants to do. As many of you know, I've recently become a pastor of a friend's church. And one of the values that friends have is the value of simplicity, about not making anything more complex than it needs to be. And one of the wonderful things about having this value of simplicity is that it really does allow for more flexibility. Because the tighter grip that people try to get on God's church, the tighter they try to hold on to their church and keep it the same and make it fit them, the less effective God's church is going to be. Because we have to hold God's church with open palms to let him do whatever works he wants to do. But that can only be possible when we keep things simple, that we allow room for God to do his work. Because really every church is God's church more than the people's church, more than the pastor's church, more than the elder's church, more than the bishop's church. It's God's church first. And so we have to leave room for God to do a work and give us direction. It's a lot like the picture that's shown in Jeremiah 18 about the potter and the clay, where God uses the potter molding the clay as an example of how God can mold his people. And we, as God's people, want to allow God to mold us, to shape us in the way we need to be shaped to be most effective for God's kingdom. You see, the changes should never be driven by our desires. They should never be driven by what we want. Instead, it should be led by God. Another thing that Gideon does in this passage is that he doesn't lead the Israelites into battle the way that any other military officer would lead a group into battle. He didn't draw their swords and shields and go running down the mountain into the camp. If he only had 300 people, no one was going to survive if he did that. And so because of that, Gideon changed the approach because of his situation. He recognized that the old tried and true method would not work in his situation. That the way that was normal would not have led him to success. And this is another aspect of flexibility that we have to keep in mind, is that flexibility needs to be driven by our context. It needs to be driven by the situation we find ourselves in. Change should never take place just for the sake of change. Change for change's sake is worthless. Instead, change needs to be driven by our context. And so when we encounter a problem that the old tried and true method will not work with, when we can't do things the way we've always done it, it doesn't work anymore, then we have to start considering, okay, well, how do we make a change so that we can continue moving forward with our mission? I read a book that one of my previous pastors gave me that was called Canoeing the Mountains. And this book was about Lewis and Clark as they were heading west across America. And they had planned to take their canoes on the river and row all the way to the other side of America. But they found out about halfway through that wasn't going to work when they encountered the mountains. And here they were with their canoes facing the mountains, and they had a choice to make. They could either go back the way they came, or they could choose to abandon their canoes and go on foot. But they had to make one of those two decisions because they couldn't canoe up the mountains. There was no way to do that. And sometimes we're faced with a situation where, we're canoeing along and we find ourselves unable to canoe any further. And when we reach those situations, we can either turn back and go back the way we came, or we can take a new approach. And I want to point out that a new approach doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the mission. See, Lewis and Clark, when they chose to abandon their canoes, they were not abandoning their mission. They were simply recognizing that in order to complete what they were setting out to do, they had to do so in a different way. That the situation they were in demanded a change. So when we encounter a problem in our ministry or in our church, because we've always done it this way and now all of a sudden it's not working, the answer isn't to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not to just cast everything aside and go looking for something else. You've heard the phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side, but there's a follow-up to that phrase, which I really like, which is that the grass is greenest on the side where it's watered. The grass isn't always greener on the other side, but the grass is always the greenest on the side where it's watered. And so when we encounter this problem, we don't want to just abandon it and leave for greener fields. But we want to look at our situation, look at the context, look at the need that is not being met anymore, and ask ourselves, what has to change in order to continue to meet that need? And if you're already meeting that need, great, don't change anything. If you're meeting the need, stay the course. If canoeing is still working, keep canoeing. Change should only take place to meet a need. But if you find yourself no longer meeting the need, then something has to change in order for you to continue to complete the mission that you've set out to accomplish. It's not abandoning the mission just because you do it differently. So why go through all this work? Why go through the process of following God's direction for change and doing change at all when we encounter these problems? Well, look at what happened in Gideon's case. Gideon was faced with an impossible battle, but yet he achieved victory. Gideon won an impossible victory because he was willing to be flexible in his approach. This is why we should care about flexibility, is because flexibility opens up new possibilities. It takes what was impossible and makes it possible. Gives us new ways to do new things to meet the same needs. The needs that have existed throughout all time, but meeting them in new ways because of our flexibility. I think about the difference between a tent and a skyscraper. Now, a skyscraper is an amazing work of architecture. It reaches all the way to the sky. It's beautiful. It's majestic, really. And compared to that, a tent looks pretty rubbish compared to a skyscraper. But you see, a skyscraper can't go very far. But a tent can go anywhere. Skyscrapers are majestic, but they can't go anywhere. They look nice, but they can't go anywhere. A tent may not be as pleasant. It may not be that majestic look, but the flexibility of a tent allows it to go wherever its owner needs it to go. It's portable. You can take it with you. And I think that the church as a whole has become very much like a skyscraper, where it looks nice, it's majestic, it's got good foundation, strong supports, but all it can do is call the people around it to itself. And I don't think God envisioned his church to be like a skyscraper. I think he envisioned it to be more like a tent that could be taken wherever the need was. And this is what we should strive to make our churches and our ministries look more like is like a tent. Being able to go wherever the need is. It's that flexibility that opens up greater possibilities. The tent being able to change its location makes it more effective. And I think this is something we really have to understand, is that when something changes, it doesn't mean that it's changing because something failed. But change is often just a sign of growth. So think about a seed. If I were to give you a seed and you planted it and watered it and took care of that seed, how would you be able to tell whether or not that seed was a healthy seed? You would gauge it on whether or not the seed changed over time. A healthy seed will continue to change in order to produce fruit. But if I give you a seed that is dead, it will stay exactly the same. And there are some churches that have stayed the same for years, stayed the same for decades. And that doesn't mean that that church is healthy. In fact, many of those churches are dying out. Churches all across the country as a whole are dying out because they're not changing. They aren't growing. See, change is necessary for growth. There is no growth without change. And if we want God to grow us as His people and to grow us as His church, then we have to be willing to let Him make changes in us. We must be willing to let God show us how to grow in order to meet people's needs. This is what flexibility does. It lets us continue to thrive in God, whereas that hope gives us the motivation to begin thriving in God. Flexibility is what gives us that longevity. It's what allows us to let God do a work in our life and help us continue to grow year after year, day after day, growing and growing so that we can continually meet the needs of people. This is what it means to thrive with flexibility. So I ask you the question, are you being flexible in your ministry? Are you being flexible in your walk with God? Do you show any change as time goes on? Or are you sitting there like a dead seed, staying exactly the same, never growing, never producing fruit? Flexibility is part of thriving with God because it's letting God mold us, helping us to grow, to meet people's needs. So I encourage you to examine your life and look at that and be willing to be flexible, especially in times like these where everything is shifting around us. The world looks so different than it did just a few months ago. Letting God make us flexible so we can continue to do what He has called us to do. I hope maybe this sermon has given you some things to think about. I hope it moves you forward and will lead you to greater works in the kingdom of God. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said, feel free to contact me through the Sermon in the Pocket Facebook page or email me at sermoninthepocket@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear your questions or comments and get in contact with you. And if you like this program and want to help cover the cost of it, the best way to do so is to pledge a support on our Patreon page. That's the best way to help finance this program. But I encourage you to share this with family and friends to get this message out. And I hope you've been enjoying this series, and I hope you come back for the next installment next week. So I pray that God will continue to bless you and be with you this week. Thank you so much for listening.